Welcome back, everybody. This video is actually more of a response to a few questions I got in the Infinite Runner series instead of a straight up tutorial. However, it does still stand on its own, so you don't actually have to have watched the series first. So as I said, a few people during the Infinite Runner series, after they decided to add their own sprites into the game, ran across a fairly normal positioning issue. So for the most part, everything is fine with the game, but you can see the issue even with just the basic square sprite that I used if I zoom into the game here. The positioning of the player character is based around the center of the object, which means that part of the sprite image is actually below that position, and so it does cut into the platform here. This is the top of the platform, and you can see that's the bottom half of the sprite, just going right into it there. And I'm actually going to add my own sprites so I can really sell how bad this can look. Just going to drag this into the assets folder. And there it is. Now let's just go over to the player and replace that square with my new player sprite. There we go. And this sprite is actually very tiny, only about 20 or so pixels tall. So I'm just going to go ahead and maybe 5x this thing. That looks about right. And I'll have a download link for this sprite if you want to download it and follow along, or just use your own. It all works the same. But in either case, you can see now that this looks pretty bad, especially if I play the game. Right? It's kind of inside the platform there. And for developers just starting out, it might not be so obvious what the problem actually is or what you should do to fix it. Right now, all we know is that we're setting the player's position, but that position is fixated on the center of the player. There are a few different ways to fix this though, and I'll go over 3 of them, and then you can pick your favorite and go from there. And maybe if you think of another one, go ahead, leave a comment, like and subscribe too. Thanks. So the first way is probably the easiest, but not one that I prefer. Just head over to the sprite asset that you want to work with and check their attributes in the inspector. You'll notice a very specific attribute here called pivot, and you'll see that it's set to center. And this basically determines how a sprite is drawn relative to the position of the object. So we have a few options here, but simple enough, we can just choose bottom and then hit apply. And then I'll head back into, I'll go ahead and replace this sprite again because I did all that in play mode. Set that back to 5, 5. And then we'll go ahead and hit play. And now you can see by setting that pivot to bottom, the bottom center of the sprite is now the pivot point relative to the actual position of the object. So there's a few reasons why I don't like this. One, it means you're doing more asset management, which I tend to not like. And 2, it just might not actually be correct, especially in this specific case where you can see that there's a few transparent pixels below the sprite anyway. So this means you'd have to draw your sprites in a very specific way just because Unity. Okay, so that was the easiest method. So let's move on to the next one. And this is probably the one that most people will go with. And I've actually grown quite fond of it, specifically when working with Unity. And all it is just a little bit of extra setup in your hierarchy to get a lot more flexibility out of your game object. And basically all I'm going to do here is say that this player game object is actually more or less a container, I guess you could say. And the sprite itself, we're going to make a child of this, right? So just create a new 2D sprite inside of this player object, and you can use whatever you want as a default. And I'm just going to call it sprite. Move the player over here. This is now going to be 5x scaled, and this player is going to go back to 1x. And then I'll make sure to get this order and layer that it was supposed to have, and then I can remove the sprite renderer here. And then all we need to do to make sure that this gets positioned correctly is to just kind of mess around with the sprite's position, because this position is local to this player object. So all we have to do is just bump it up on the y-axis a little bit. 3, 4, 5, 5. There, his foot just touches, and that's pretty close. So 0.55. And I'll just exit play mode and set that. There we go. Looking good, and it's even better than the just the pivot method, right? And this also adds a nice layer of separation between the object and the sprite itself. So I could do whatever I needed to with the sprite, like scale it up 5 times and not worry about messing up any of the settings for the actual player object. And if I had even multiple Like if my player was made up of multiple small sprites, I could just put them all in here and position them however I needed to. I like this method a lot because I think it's also a creative way of using Unity's hierarchy of game object transforms to your advantage. And there's plenty of other things that this can simplify just by nesting game objects, like maybe rotations, but I'm not going to get into that now. Let's move on to the third and final method that I'm going to go over. And the final method here is pretty similar to the previous. However, it does involve some programming, so I know it's going to turn off a lot of people. Basically, what we were doing with the child game object being the offset into the parent, we're just going to actually define that offset as a variable and then change a couple of calculations like where the ground is and where the raycasts are. All right, so I'm just going to go into the player script here. So I'm basically going to try and define where the sprite's feet are by using some y offset, like I mentioned. So simple enough, y offset or offset y, however you want to do that. And I already know based on our previous example that it's something like 0.55. And now that we have that, basically this value plus our current position becomes our actual position that we end up having. So I only have to change the code in a couple places, one being what defines this ground height, and that's basically every time that we land. So that's down here by this first raycast. And really all we have to do is just add our offset onto that ground height. And that way the player's position is actually pushed up by that amount above the ground. And the only other places that we actually need to apply this offset are in our ray origins. So wherever we're putting our Y position, we want to make sure to subtract the offset. And that way the origin of the raycast gets pushed down to the bottom of the sprite. So I'll just copy this and paste that to every raycast origin that I have there. There, and maybe you don't want this for every raycast because maybe I don't know exactly how I want my obstacle collisions to work yet. Let's just take a look and see if our offset's working. And there we go. It's exactly where it was when we were doing the sub-game object. And now I'm offset by that 0.55 units, right? And the jumping works just like it used to. And we can test the obstacle collisions. They seem to work as well. Seems pretty good. So there you have it. That's 3 pretty different ways to get your sprites positioned the way that you want. You can also combine them, mix and match them if you really want. Let me know which is the most interesting, which one you prefer, and if you have your own methods. Thank you very much for taking the time to check this out, and I'll see you next time.